Hello, and thank you for joining us today. Hopefully, you're all here to hear from us at APTEM and Ian from BNU and Kerry from Finn. Our presentation today is titled Ofsted in the Higher Education Sector, Insights from an Inspection Nominee. Hopefully, this is going to be an extremely insightful session. So for anyone that doesn't know me, I'm Sean Baker. I'm Head of New Business here at APTEM. And I'm delighted to be hosting today's webinar, and I'm sure all of you on the webinar today and all of those of you who listen to this recorded session afterwards will agree this is a great opportunity to hear directly from someone who has been through an Ofsted inspection as a recent nominee. So just then to kick off with some housekeeping to begin with. Before we get started with some introductions, I wanted to draw your attention to a couple of items. So first of all, we are recording this session, and everyone who has registered will receive a copy via email. So please feel free to share this with your colleagues internally. And in terms of the webinar, you are muted throughout. So if you need assistance, please feel free to use the chat functionality. You can also ask questions in the question sections of the panel. And we do like to keep this open and engaging. So please do drop any of your questions throughout the session into the questions panel. And we'll get to as many of these as we can by the end of the webinar today. Brilliant. So it's with great pleasure then today to introduce Ian and Kerry, both of whom I've worked with closely both during my role here at APTEM and previous roles within higher education. So prior to joining APTEM, I worked at Buckinghamshire New University in a few roles, including reporting and compliance manager and later operations manager. And I was fortunate enough to work under Ian's stewardship during our time, around 4 years at the university. And that included being part of a team leading our response to an interim visit back in November 2020, of which I'm sure many of you on this call remember. That was around the height of COVID-19, so it was an interesting interim inspection to say the least. In terms of Ian today, so he's got a very a detailed background and a vast experience across the sector for over 25 years. His previous experience was at an independent training provider, an ITP, becoming chief executive in 2010. And in 2014, he joined Buckinghamshire New University, BNU, to oversee the construction and establishment of the Aylesbury campus in partnership with the local FE colleges. And he has led the university's degree apprenticeship provision since 2018. Ian has been a governor of an FE college for the last 9 years and has held governor roles at primary schools and a school for children with special needs as well. He has experienced many Ofsted and adult learning inspectorate inspections in those various roles and has been a nominee on 3 occasions, most recently in September 2023 for BNU. As Commercial and Business Development Director, Ian has responsibility for academic partnerships, apprenticeships, and commercial aspects of the university's delivery, such as accommodation and fundraising as well. So certainly keeps Ian busy. I'd also like to introduce Kerry Boffey, who's on the call as well, who many of you may know from previous webinars in the work that she does with us here at APTEM. Kerry is the CEO and the founder of the Fellowship of Inspection Nominees, Finn, and as a former Ofsted inspector, has over 17 years experience. Kerry has worked across the UK and on international project managing teams and providers through very challenging inspections due to their complexity. This in-depth understanding of inspection, alongside concerns for the lack of effective preparation by providers, was the driver behind starting Finn and that being set up. Membership of Finn includes all types of providers, colleges, ITPs and universities, and Kerry and her team support and strengthen the nominee role in preparation for Ofsted inspections. Ian will be kindly sharing his experience of a recent full inspection today from the perspective, of course, of a nominee, and Kerry will be offering her insights and thoughts as well alongside. So a great combination I think we've got here today for the next hour or so. Without any further ado, we've got a lot to get through, so I'll now pass on to Ian to take us through. Thanks, Ian.
Thank you very much, Sean. Thank you for the introduction and welcome everybody. As Sean said, I work at Buckinghamshire New University. I'm going to take you through about half an hour of slide content talking about my relatively recent experience as a nominee. Hopefully there's some useful information there. You'll see as I go through the slides, you'll see little asterisks pop up, and I'm going to bring Kerry in to provide some insight to bolster some of the points I'll make. But if I can move on to the next slide. Thank you. So a little bit of a history about the university. I won't go on too long about this, but we've been around in one guise or another for over 130 years. We've been a university since 2007. We're one of those post-92 institutions that had been things like a technical college or a further education college at various points in its life. We've got 3 campuses. I'm sat in our main campus at the moment in High Wycombe. We have a campus in Aylesbury, and we have a satellite campus in Uxbridge on the fringes of London. As Sean said, we began our apprenticeship journey pretty much 6 years ago now, in early 2018, and it was an obvious move for us because when you look at our history as a further education provider, the course portfolio that we have, which is incredibly vocational, our history and our link to our local and regional employers, it made absolute sense for us to move into the higher and degree level apprenticeship space. And at the time of the inspection, we had just over 1,000 learners on 13 different programs. I think we're slightly above that at the moment. The numbers move around a bit, as you'd understand, at various points of the year. But we have ambitions to grow to something in the region of 2,500 apprenticeships over the next few years. The next slide, please. So a little bit about our inspection history. We last had a full Ofsted inspection in 2017, but that was for a very small level 3 art and design diploma cohort. I think it was 33 learners at the time. I wasn't involved, but that was the extent of our institution's Ofsted experience. We began those apprenticeships in 2018, and as Sean said in his introduction, we did have a remote monitoring inspection in November 2020 that Sean assisted us with. He and I were working together at the time, and that was really Ofsted coming in to check that things were going okay, particularly that we were looking after our learners in the pandemic and making sure that remote delivery was happening as it should be. We took a significant step in our journey in March 2021. We joined Finn, and it's true to say that doing so gave us the support, the coaching, the interventions that we needed to get to the satisfactory position that we were in. I should say satisfactory. We were the good position we ended up in September when we did have our full inspection, but we'd been waiting for inspection for quite some time. You can imagine growing from 0 students in 2018 to in excess of 1,000 by 2022. We knew we were on the radar and likely to be inspected. So we were in a stage of semi-preparedness, but Finn really helped us get into a position where we were confident going into an inspection. Next slide, please. So we got the call, and we had the call on the Friday. This was Friday, I think it was the 15th of September. I was on leave. It's always the way these things happen. We got a call at, I think, 8:45 in the morning to say that Ofsted would be coming in from Tuesday to Friday for a full inspection. I kind of made it into High Wycombe as quickly as I could. I had a couple of initial calls with the lead inspector, and we started to understand the scope of the inspection and the size of the inspection team. So we would have 7 inspectors with us for 4 days, so 28 days worth of inspection activity taking place. The new inspection handbook had just been released at the beginning of September, so it was made clear that we would be inspected in accordance with the contents of that handbook. And the lead inspector took me through the nominee, the rules, if you like, kind of rules of engagement, what I could do, what part I would play, what I couldn't do, and so on. She also took us through a shadow nominee role. It's not something I'd had before, but I've got my head of apprenticeships is a lady called Preeti Karbanda. She's fantastic. My whole team have been brilliant, actually. But Preeti was my shadow nominee. And the lead took us through that shadow nominee role and what Preeti could do in that role, and again what she couldn't. She's a bit of a silent partner in the room, but the critical thing for me was she was in the room, which helped, and I'll come on to that in a bit. But the lead inspector talked us through what meetings were likely to take place over the next couple of days as we move towards the inspection day on the Tuesday itself. We had to make sure that we got our AppTem and our other systems, so our EQA processes, Blackboard, our virtual learning environment, making sure that we could get the appropriate levels of access organized for our inspectors. And the lead inspector took us through the portal. So for those of you not aware of this, this is a portal that Ofsted set up. It's a secure area where the provider can upload evidence, information, data, etc. our first experience of that was the kind of initial data requests that she provided. And I'll go back to my notes to make sure I don't miss these off, because this will probably be of interest to those of you expecting inspection soon. We were asked to provide a list of our current courses and the numbers of learners on those courses, their start dates, their end dates, their employers, any learners with declared disabilities, highlight any 16 to 18 learners. We didn't have very many, but we did have a few, and their location of study and their timetables. So there's quite a lot for us to do, but this comes back to making sure that your self-assessment report is updated, because if you've got current data sets and things you can draw on, it makes this process relatively quick. And she talked about the opportunity for us to deliver an opening presentation. And this was only a very short 10-minute slot at the start of the first day of inspection. And I'll move on to that in a minute, but I'm going to bring Kerry in at this point, which is the asterisk.
Hello, everybody. This is, thanks, Ian. This is about the opening presentation, and this is something that don't wait until you get the call to do. This is something you can actually do now. Have a think about the slides that you would present, and I would recommend that you only have maximum of 10 slides, but think about what you would want them to really know. If you had to give them 2 or 3 key messages that they really got from the instant coming onto your provision, what would you want to know? And that's what you put in that PowerPoint. You can always update it, and it's so much easier to just update on a regular basis and say, well, I haven't been for 3 months, let's tweak those slides, because that moves with you. But it's really important that you set the impression from the outset, but that also you've got those key messages in mind of what do you really want them to know? What's really critical about your organization that you need them to understand really, really quickly. So it's about just doing it now. Don't wait until you get the call. There is absolutely no reason why you shouldn't start that presentation now.
Thank you, Kerry. Yes, good advice. And we certainly did have something ready to go with a few last minute tweaks and additions. And I got our Vice Chancellor to deliver that presentation. It was all about making sure that apprenticeships were seen as front and centre, an important part of BNU's provision. So he delivered that for us. And then the final thing we talked through was timetables for inspectors, and it's about keeping them busy. I talked about 7 inspectors for 4 days, so 28 days worth of inspection. It was really difficult for us because, of course, they came on the 19th to the 22nd of September, which put it squarely in the middle of our kind of enrolment, freshers, etc. So we naturally have a bit of a lull in some of our apprenticeship activity deliberately so we can accommodate our undergraduate program. So they were coming precisely when we wouldn't have as much to show them as we normally would. And it became a bit of a point of contention, actually, between me and the nominee and the lead inspector about the lack of busyness for the inspectors. It was a real challenge to find sufficient activity to keep them all occupied. But as I've put there, keep them as busy as you can, prepare to be flexible. Our plans were pretty much not ripped up entirely, but they did change quite substantially as the 4 days unfolded, as lines of inquiries opened or things were settled and they closed them down. So just keep that flexibility in mind. Next slide, please. So a bit of essential reading. The FE, the Further Education and Skills Handbook, and as I mentioned before, this was a new version of this handbook that had just come out. I can't stress this more. Read it, print it, go through it, scribble notes, highlight it, and keep it with you. I had a dog-eared old copy hanging around with me by the end of the week, because everything you need to know about how they're going to inspect you, what they're looking for, what's in scope, but critically, what judgments they'll make and what the grade descriptors look like. So make yourself really familiar with what those good and outstanding grade descriptors for each of those judgments look like, but critically make sure your curriculum and department leads know that too, because then they can make sure that between now and whenever you're inspected, good practice is something that you are encouraging, you're identifying where it takes place, and you're identifying where it isn't taking place, and you can see where you've got to get to before inspection. So that handbook is critical. Do that work now. I mentioned your self-assessment report, your SAR. It shouldn't be just a legacy document you churn out once a year and put on a shelf. You should be reviewing it regularly, and you should be living your quality improvement plan, your QIP. Because again, when Ofsted come, they can see that problems or challenges that you've identified, you're already working on. They can see things in train. Don't wait for inspection to create the library. I talked about the portal earlier on. My reporting and compliance manager, a chap called Alex Morrison, has got an absolute wealth of data sets, information. My other colleagues have collected information, and it was a relatively straightforward process for us to get those uploaded to the portal. So I would suggest you almost have a shadow portal ready. So build a library now of things that you would upload to the portal when Ofsted come. It's things like your data sets, your attendance records, your attainment gaps for people with disability, or your gender attainment gaps. There will be a whole load of requests coming out during the week that you can't necessarily foresee, but my team were fantastic. I would come out of the regular meetings with inspectors, go down to the apprenticeship offices, and more often than not, they'd either second guessed what we were going to be asked for and had it ready to upload, or they could quickly respond to it. But if you start that work now, you're not then spending the weekend ahead of inspection desperately trying to claw data sets from places to get them ready for the week. I mentioned a shadow nominee, and Preeti was our shadow nominee. Appoint one if you can. That's my personal view here. It was always my intention that to do that would put Preeti in a stronger position should I not be available in a few years when they come back, or should I just wish to hand that responsibility over. But actually, it really helped share some of the load, because whilst the shadow can't take part in the discussions when it comes to the keep in touch events at the beginning of the day and the judgment meetings at the end of the day, they are someone who can help you take notes, because you will get a very sore hand frantically scribbling. If you've got a second pair of ears and a second hand in the room, that person can capture some of the things, and Preeti captured plenty of stuff that I just simply wasn't able to scribble down quickly enough. And then Preeti and I could confer afterwards and check notes with one another. So I found that a real support and really helped the inspection move along. I've got an asterisk here, so Kerry, you've got an insight here.
Yes, and to be honest, Ian, what you've just said is very much the case of it sharing the load. Think carefully about who you're going to have as that shadow nominee. Think about there's two characteristics. The one person needs to be able to articulate provision, understand provision. The other person needs to be detailed and make notes and be able to signpost where they might find that. But practice it. When you've identified somebody in your team who's going to be your shadow, go to an event, go to something, go to a meeting, and actually one of you contribute to the meeting, the other one make notes, and you can see how well you work together so that you are ready and practiced at that. It's really important. And as Ian says, you can't actually but debate and be involved in a conversation and make detailed notes. It's just physically impossible. So if you've got that other person that is another half of you to do that, then it makes your job so much easier. But again, it's about preparation well before in advance. Do it now. Have a practice now. See how well you work. It's like that, the yin to your yang. Make sure that person fits in well with you. Ofsted will say, is it going to be a person that will be trained in the future? Is it's ready for their preparation? I would say you need to be more selfish than that and think, what's the best for our organisation to maximise that opportunity so that the nominee is fully supported? And that's what's critical here. It's supporting the nominee in that role.
Thank you, Kerry. And my final point on that slide seems a bit glib, but we all know who amongst your teams who needs to be there for inspection. They are pivotal people, and people that you might want to be on holiday when inspectors come, but I won't dwell on that one. Next slide, please. The base room, as Sean said in his introduction for me, I think I've been a nominee 3 times, twice for Ofsted and once for the Adult Learning Inspectorate way back in about 2006. And in those days, the base room was somewhere you almost literally wallpapered with data, and you filled with folders of data, and none of that's required. The lead inspector made very clear what was required in terms of a base room, and it was quite basic actually, and basic comforts. So I would definitely choose a room with video conferencing, because although we didn't intend for our inspectors to be on different sites at the beginning and end of every day, that's what actually happened. So we were able to then dial in colleagues from places like Uxbridge and Aylesbury and not have to factor in travel time. So put video conferencing in that room, and just consider the location. We were very careful about the room we chose, because you really need to try and control where the inspectors are. You don't want them wandering all around your institution unaccompanied. So it's best to try and keep them corralled into one position. Apart from anything else, it helps you, because if you can base yourself in an office close to the base room, you will put in many fewer steps than you otherwise might. And I spent pretty much, other than the formal meetings, I spent the rest of the week running around, meeting their requests, communicating with colleagues, but I could do that because my office was pretty much 2 doors down from the base room, and I could keep in constant contact with the lead and some of the other inspectors. I said they have an assistant for the week. That's not the same role as the shadow nominee. That's just somebody who can be a bit of a runner, because there are phone calls to make, phone calls to take, things that will go wrong that need sorting out. And if you've got someone who can at the last minute organise parking at a satellite site or an employer's site, it's something you don't have to spend your time doing when you might be involved in something more crucial, like getting a pivotal data set together or something like that. Make sure you've got multiple small rooms for meetings and calls, but again, keep those inspectors local to you. So our inspectors spent quite some time on telephone calls with learners. So they conducted quite a lot of telephone interviews, and they need a relatively quiet private space to be able to do that. And keep on you a phone list for people you need to get hold of quickly. So again, part of that Ofsted preparation is now, before you get the call, understand who it is that you'll need to be liaising with in the course of an inspection, have their numbers to hand, have a bit of a plan. That there are protocols you need to set up within your institution. So when that phone call comes in, who takes it? What happens with that phone call? Who does it then get disseminated to? Everything like that can be sorted out beforehand, so you're not trying to deal with it on the hoof. We made substantial use of Teams. We did this in the interim inspection back in November 2020 when the inspection was entirely remote, and it worked really well this time as well, because Teams allows you to create those sites, which are obviously out of sight of the Ofsted inspection team, so you can share documents and you can have kind of post-mortem catch-ups, if you like, with people after meetings. So you can really, as a nominee, really keep a handle on what people are being asked, what people have said, what evidence is coming forward, what lines of inquiry are opened, and you can then help pre-prepare the teams and the classes and things that Ofsted are going to see following that. And get yourself prepared for the 3 surveys, the learner, employer and staff surveys. I don't mind admitting we had an administrative muck-up, and it turned out our staff survey was never sent. And it looked a little awkward because it looked as if we were trying not to get the views of our staff. That wasn't the case. It was a genuine error, but it's making sure that those are ready to go and someone is responsible and knows what to do when to make sure those surveys go out when they should. Next slide, please. So the next few slides, a little bit about the chronology and what actually happened. Day one is a whirlwind. 7 inspectors all making heavy calls on my time. You need a notebook and a stack of pens, because you will be making substantial notes. There'll be lots of inquiries. Use Teams, as I said before, use that wisely to be able to work with people across your organisation, but keep yourself close to the lead so that he or she knows they can come to you for anything. We talked about the opening presentation. We had a QSR, a success rate calculation anomaly, and it was a good opportunity. As Kerry said, we knew what we were going to deliver in terms of key messages, but one of them for us was that we had this QSR anomaly for a group of learners that were appearing twice as leavers. And of course, on the data, that looked worse than the reality. So we were able to cover that off and really just put that one away, so it didn't open up a line of inquiry that we didn't really want to go down in the course of the inspection. I made it my business to attend as many of the early meetings as I possibly could to get a bit of a flavour of what was happening. And these are human beings, so there are human interactions, and you really do get a sense of the mood, optimism, pessimism, all that kind of stuff. So attend as many of those early meetings as you can, so you can understand how things are starting to unfold in that day one. But at the end of that day, for our inspection, the inspectors delivered the feedback by programme. So I think they looked at 8 of our 13 programmes. So they were actually providing judgments from different inspectors program by program on that first day. It changed for the latter days, and I'll come on to that. But your role there with your shadow, if you have one, is to capture those emerging themes, capture what the lines of inquiry are going to be for the next day, because you will meet in the morning in what's called a keep in touch event. So you have an idea about what's coming up the next day. I found there was little to challenge at this stage, because they were making early judgments based on limited information and limited exposure to apprentices, learners and colleagues. But make sure your colleagues are prepared for probably what would be a late finish, because there'll be a lot to do at this stage, because you've got all these different inquiries. It starts to then shape what's going to happen over the next, in our case, 3 days. and it made our timetable for the next 3 days look very different to the timetable we put out at the start of day 1. Next slide, please. So day 2 begins with one of those kites, keep in touch event. And this is your opportunity, should there be any, to dispute anything erroneous, correct any errors, but also to point inspectors towards any evidence that you think, if there's something that's a line of inquiry you want to shut down, have you got a body of evidence or some data or something to show them? Have you got something that could bolster something that's been of concern? Day 2, again, whirlwind of activity, and it ends with feedback, but this time it's delivered by judgment area. So for the first time, they start to collate their judgments in the leadership and management, quality of education, behaviours and attitudes, personal development categories. And again, this is where you get your handbook. And I was sat there with my pen and highlighter and ticking off. So I started to get a little bit of a feel about where things were heading. Had I got plenty of good indicators appearing to be cropping up in their judgments? Are there data sets you can shore up a difficult area? Is proportionality relevant? This is something that cropped up quite a lot for us. So proportionality is where typically Ofsted might have something that's of concern to them, but it perhaps only affects a minority of your provision. And we had that. We had in one particular area, and we were quite open about this in our self-assessment report, one particular area we knew had a difficult 2 or 3 years and was weaker than the other areas. And it was about making sure they kept that sense of proportion and didn't mentally extrapolate, oh, well, that weak practice there must be happening in all the other programs as well. So it's making sure you're on top of that so that they're not being swayed to go and look at something that perhaps isn't there. But keep your curriculum and department leads informed about those emerging lines of inquiry and areas of concern and support them. What have they got that they can use to mitigate that? What good practice have they got they can show? Or what improvements do they have in train that show that they've acknowledged the problem and they are doing something about it? And what new activity can you point them to? Don't be afraid to change the timetable here. So if you think there's a session that you weren't originally going to have inspectors visit that you think might address a particular concern, just change the schedule and get that there. Kerry, you're going to come in on this point.
Just really to make more of that you just made in, this is where the nominee is really critical, that you are thinking on your feet, and this is where you will have those conversations with your shadow nominee to look at the grade descriptors, because his slide is absolutely right. It unfolds. You can then look at the grade descriptors. You can see where it's heading and change the schedule. If you think there's something in your provision, which is, as Ian's just said, that can change your mind or reinforce a strength, or we can, if they've identified an area for improvement and you can say, well, that's isolated, it is absolutely critical that you take action here and you present it to the lead inspector. And if they say no, you would come back with why, because this is how we're going to show it. You can be honest and say, you've identified this as an area for a weakness, but actually we know that if you go to this lesson, or if you meet this learner, if you can such and such, it will help you to triangulate your evidence. They want to make sure that they've got a very strong and robust evidence base, so they're not going to say no. In the unlikely event, and this again is where the skill of the nominee is important, in the unlikely event that inspectors refuse to meet a group of learners or refuse to go to a session, you can then say to them, I'd like that on an evidence form that you've refused to meet those learners, that you haven't wanted to do that. So again, if that rolls into a problem for you, you've actually got the opportunity to say, well, we did put it on the schedule and you didn't want to do it. So this is where, during that inspection, the nominee has to be very strong, very positive, but determined.
Thank you, Kerry. Okay, last couple of slides. So day 3, as with day 2, began with a keep in touch event. And again, it's about working with the lead to influence what the other inspectors will be doing over the course of that day. This was where the survey results, the learner, the employer, and the staff survey results were worked through. And you've got to think on your feet here, because actually you don't get given those results in printout or computer form. You're just told them verbally. So you really have to react. It's anonymized, so you don't know who said what. So this set off a few lines of inquiry for us. It was about making sure I kind of second guessed where a comment might have come from and thought, well, what could I do to perhaps close that off, or what could I do to bolster something that was of a concern. The third day was pretty much the last day where you could do anything serious to address an area of weakness, because day 4, as you'll see, is a bit of a wash-up day. Same format as day 2, ended with that feedback delivered in accordance with the 4 judgments, but you really have now got a really strong idea of where things are heading. And at this stage, we knew then that we were likely to be heading for good in all 4 of those grade descriptors. We'd self-assessed as good in all 4 areas. We knew we weren't going to be outstanding. But equally, I think we were confident we weren't going to be anything less than good. But on saying that, the start of day 3 was a low point for us, because some of the comments from the learner and employer survey were a little negative, and you start thinking, oh, okay, human nature kicks in, and you start worrying a little. But that proportionality came in. We were able to kind of work out where those comments were. They were utterly fair. We couldn't dispute them. They were the learner's real lived experiences. But we were able to demonstrate that they were in a minority group in an area where we had acknowledged problems in our self-assessment report, and we had evidence that we had implemented improvements. What we couldn't do was show that those improvements were sufficiently mature to show an evidence of outcome, improvement in outcome yet. But Ofsted were content that actually improvements were moving things for that small area in the right direction. And it's about checking those grade descriptors again, because again, that helps you cement where those judgments are likely to end up. Give yourself some time overnight, because if you think there are any areas that you are likely to be able to challenge, it will be your very last opportunity to do so in the Keep in Touch event in the next morning and shape the course of that last day's inspection activity. So we'll come on to the final day, please. So again, there we go. Begins with the Keep in Touch event. We found on this day, the inspectors spent very little time with learners or employers. It was really an administrative day. So they were up in the offices around the base room, really collating all of their evidence. There was quite a call on my time on this day, because there were loose ends they wanted tidying up. I think Alex, my reporting and compliance manager, did a lot of work this day uploading the last tranche of data and evidence to the portal. There was a lot went on in that day. And it ends with that final judgment and grading session. And again, the handbook comes out, and it's making sure you're ticking those off. And we knew by then, by the balance of the judgments, that we were in literally a good position in all of them. And I think in personal behaviours, we had a couple of the outstanding indicators. We know we were strong in that area. But it is your last chance to challenge any erroneous conclusions. I have to say, I didn't really have to get involved in any serious challenging in the course of the week, because we found the way the inspection was conducted to be completely fair, very transparent. All of the judgments they made were based on firm evidence that we couldn't dispute. So really my role was quite easy in that respect. I've been through a couple before. It's been a bit more bruising, and there's been a bit more back and forth. But ordinarily that would be your last chance to challenge any erroneous conclusions. I think that brings me to the end of my section. Sean, am I handing back to you at this stage?
Thank you, Ian. I mean, now I think is the sort of perfect time for questions, I would say. If we're happy, then we go on to Kerry's slides afterwards, while it's all fresh in everyone's memories. So feel free to use the chat functionality or the questions section of GoToWebinar to pop your questions in. We do have a couple that have come in during the course of the last half an hour or so. One of them in particular for Ian is around the move from the Common Inspection Framework, the CIF as it was known, to the Education Inspection Framework. And really the sort of suggestion that they're moving more away from the data itself and more towards learning and teaching observations. I mean, how did that manifest itself in your inspection? Did you see a real shift in how they went about the inspection? Did you see them utilizing less data? And how much work did you do preparing for the inspection in terms of your data itself?
Yes, a good question. I think I alluded to it before in that if you look at the base room preparation, if I go back to old inspections, it was papering the walls with data and filling the room with folders. Other than that initial data request, The only other data requests that came through were more ad hoc, and they were inquiries that arose from the activity they'd seen whilst on their visits to learners, to employers, and talking to staff and seeing sessions. So there was, other than that initial data set, that was the big change for me, that they weren't constantly saying, give me data for this, give me data for that, can you explain this data trend, or can you explain that anomaly? It was very much, we've been to see this session, attendance might have only been something like 75%. What evidence have you got that attendance in those sessions is normally at least that? And I could get my reporting and compliance manager to go away and interrogate the system and upload an attendance summary to the portal. So they were ad hoc inquiries that arose as a consequence of their wandering about activity, shall we say, rather than please give us reams and reams and reams of data. And I wasn't getting hit with lots of requests for data.
It's really interesting. Thank you, Ian. And I have a question that's come in from Emma. So in terms of the dates, had you provided that sort of enrolment first couple of weeks of teaching in your not available dates to Ofsted in advance? Did they take any notice of that, I guess, is the question?
Yes, we had. I think, if I recall correctly, it'd be roughly at this time of the year, I think it was, they'd asked us for a bit of a calendar of, I think it was, Kerry might be able to correct me here, but I think they asked for, I think there's 8 weeks in the year that you can specify you would prefer not to have inspection. So yes, as a university, we have things like a graduation week, enrollment week, freshers week. So we set those out. And if you've got any people that have got an immovable holiday, it might be a honeymoon or something like that, then you might want to, put that in there as well. But we always understood they were a preference. So I'm not going to say they ignored them, but I did make the point to the lead inspector that it was unfortunate. Had the team arrived 2 or 3 weeks earlier or 2 or 3 weeks later, they could have seen a lot more activity because we would have been in the natural flow of things, rather than a little bit of a deliberate lull to make sure we were accommodating the natural activity of our undergraduate provision at the time.
Very interesting again. Thank you, Ian. And just a question here from Sarah in terms of the 8 programs selected, Ian. Or how were the 8 programs selected, I guess, in that sense? I mean, were there any pattern to the programs that they selected? I mean, I know you sort of hear the biggest, best and worst analogy. Does that sort of come through at all, I guess?
Yeah. I mean, we are, I don't think I said this in kind of my introductory slides, but we have a high exposure to public sector apprenticeships. So we've got a lot of registered nurse, a lot of nursing associate, and a lot of police constable degree apprenticeships, and some social workers as well. So we've got a high kind of public sector presence, big numbers on those programs. So naturally that we knew they were going to inspect those programs. I think we had acknowledged that things like senior leader and chartered manager had been slightly weaker parts of our provision in the past, and naturally, I think, as you say, biggest, best and worst, they came and had a look at those. But again, where they found some, where they identified some problems there, we were able to demonstrate the proportionality argument. And actually, we had made some very recent interventions that hadn't yet borne fruit, but they were comfortable that they were going to. So I think it was very much certainly the biggest and the ones that perhaps were of most concern. And yeah, probably the registered nurse is one of our best areas, but I think by sheer size, they were always going to inspect that area.
Great. And did they observe reviews at all?
Yes, I think we have the setup we have here is we have an apprenticeship hub, so that the hub supports centrally all the apprenticeship delivery activity. So we have 9 academic schools. I think 7 of those schools deliver at least one apprenticeship standard. And whilst the schools are responsible for the academic delivery, it's the hub that coordinates the funding, the quality, the compliance, and the reviews. So the tripartite reviews are carried out by, we call them APMs, Apprenticeship Partnership Managers, and those APMs, and we have reviewer roles as well. Those 2 groups of people carry out the tripartite reviews, but they are managed and controlled by the hub. But the Ofsted inspection did observe some of those tripartite sessions. I think it's fair to say that was a particular strength. I think when you look at some of the judgments in the report, it's a shame because 28 days of activity got distilled to something like 4 pages of Ofsted report. I mean, my notes filled half a book, but it was quite clear that those tripartite reviews and the content and the structure of those, Ofsted considered them to be really strong because they gave a really good evidence of a tailored program to each learner, an opportunity to pick up any problems where a learner is perhaps struggling or drifting away from their intended progression, an opportunity to make sure things like breaks in learning are properly discussed and programmed, a really good opportunity to cover things like safeguarding, prevent British values, which we don't just do by rote. You know, there are some genuinely engaging, proper discussions taking place at those tripartite reviews that cover those aspects of the provision that I think Ofsted really valued.
That's great, thank you, Ian. And thank everyone for their questions in the chat. There's been lots coming in, which is brilliant. Just sort of finally then, in terms of your views, and this is one for Kerry and for yourself, Ian, in terms of your views, you mentioned it sort of briefly throughout the presentation in terms of the role of the deputy nominee or the shadow nominee. I mean, is this a common approach, I guess? And secondly, you know, would you certainly endorse this sort of approach and making sure you've got those sort of roles allocated before an inspection takes place?
I'll let Kerry's probably better placed to me to judge how common it is. I mean, I would wholeheartedly endorse it. Going back to what Kerry said, it's about having the right two people, nominee and shadow nominee, the right people for the institution at that point. So there's no point putting someone on there for their personal development if they're not the right person at that point. And as Kerry said, it's about that that relationship that those two people have. And I'm fortunate I've got a very good relationship with Preeti, and we were able to work very well together in the course of that week, keep one another's spirits up when you know, sometimes you lack a bit of energy. But that relationship's really important. But I found that a real boon. I think I would have struggled to absorb, make notes and reflect on the sheer volume of information coming at me, particularly at the end of each day, had I not got Preeti to my side, helping with those notes and taking in that information.
Thank you, Ian. And Kerry, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I think Ian summarised that very well. It is now something that Ofsted have introduced, and everybody can have a shadow nominee. So it is something, that a facility that is open to you now for every provider.
Brilliant, that's great, good to know. Great, in terms of the next couple of slides, just a couple of slides, Kerry, do you want to sort of jump into the next couple of slides and run through those?
Yeah, absolutely. So we'll go on to the next slide, please. And go on to the next one as well, because we all get copies of these so you can read about what Fin can offer. One of the things I wanted to reiterate is that we strongly believe that the power of the influence, as a nominee, you have more influence over your inspection now, 12 months, 18 months, 2 years before your inspection than ever you do during, and absolutely very little afterwards. Now is the time to get to know that education inspection framework, to understand it, to look at those grade descriptors, to put that evidence in place, or to know where you're going with that. And if you've got a problem in your provision, to understand that journey of how you're going to improve it, because it'll be really important how you show them where you've come from at inspection. So now is the time for that preparation, not just we've had the call, what do we do now? So it's just about the power of influence. If you just want to go on the next slide, please. So what did Buckinghamshire New University do? Well, they joined Fin, which of course I'm going to say that was the right thing to do. But they really understood their data. So they, I know that Ian said that Ofsted didn't look at the data that much, but that's partly because the university were able to say, this is how we use our data. We understand our data. We can show you how we've utilized that data. It means that the inspectors don't need to worry about your data from the point of view of you're utilizing it. So it's really, really important that you use your data, you show how you analyze it and how you use it to improve your provision. If you don't, then the inspection will take a lot more time on trying to understand it, or they will do that understanding for you, and that never ends well. So it's really important you understand your data. From our point of view, they engaged in CPD, they understood their provision, they knew what their areas for improvement were. They were very open about talking to us, saying, well, these are the problems we've got, how do we go about it? How do we measure that? So it was very, very open dialogue. They attended our boot camp, and they were very active members of the Fin community. So Preeti's been on quite a number of events and get involved in our networking groups. Because of the analysis, which I'll show you in a moment, they were very good at responding to the analysis. So they were able to keep an eye on what the trends are. And one of the trends that we have continually brought up is this need for impartial advice and guidance. We know inspectors are going to look at it. So don't just sit there and let it happen. Make sure that you've got the evidence for. So they were also very positive about how they work with employers, very much about the progress reviews. We had a conversation a long time ago about they knew how important those progress reviews were, and it's really come through in their inspection. So it's about understanding your provision, which is great. And it was clear all the way through when we were working with Ian and Prissy and the team, is that they understood their provision, leaders and managers, and that focus on quality of education. So I have to be honest, they've been a delight to work with. So we're very, very happy to have them as FIN members. Right, on to the next slide, please. So we look at inspection grades, so we analyse all the grades, we look at all the reports, we put them into a database, we understand who the lead inspectors are, what their grade profiles are, so we have that in-depth knowledge and understanding of what's going on in the landscape. Can you just go on to the next slide, please, because I'm conscious of time. This is because there hasn't been to date too many HE inspections yet, we are looking for that, and it slightly skews that data, but that from the point of view of, it looks like a large number, but there's actually 30 who've come out with good, which is great during that period of time. So what I think you might be interested in now is on to the next slide, please. Oh, sorry, it wasn't the next one, it was the one before. So how we use that data is that we use it to advise our members, to be able to give them the most current information. It's about making sure that our resources are up to date and reflect the nuances, the patterns. We have working groups to talk through, because actually, yes, we're experienced in our field, but actually there comes an awful lot from the members, and you've benefited from listening to Ian today, and that's absolutely, some of the things that Ian said are brilliant, and I really hope you take some of the comments on board. It's about learning from each other. Why start from scratch? Why reinvent the wheel? Talking to each other. There's a lot of expertise out there, and getting together. Ensure your nominee support needs are met and that they reflect the current thinking, to plan your CPD. Right, if you just want to the next slide, please. This is one of the things that we call Ofsted's comfy slippers. So we actually analyse the areas for improvement, and it was particularly coming out as careers advice and guidance. However, more recently, when you just look at HEIs, you can see that interventions and progress monitoring has come up as an area for interest. So again, it's about understanding how these trends are changing. So again, it's about what's happening there. What are inspectors looking for at this moment in time? Starting points and information, advice and guidance is still a very popular one. Okay, move on to the next slide, please. And I call them Ofsted's comfy slippers because if that's what they're going to look for, if that's what they've seen in the last week's inspection or the week before's inspection, it's an easy hit for them. So don't have a home goal. Know what those trends are. Know what they're looking for. This is just a sample of some of the inspection resources that we have. They're all infographics. They're all easy to use to help you strengthen that nominee role. Next slide, please. We really believe that if you focus on quality, that is the very best inspection preparation, because it isn't about paper over in the cracks. It's about ensuring that you've got that robust evidence in place. And that's one of the things that Ian and his team definitely did, is that they understood the process of triangulation, they knew about the evidence, so it's about making sure that you've got evidence. At the end of the day, if you understand inspection and you understand your provision and triangulation and the evidence, then actually you will have a positive experience at inspection. But if you're faffing around looking for evidence because you haven't taken the time beforehand, then it's going to be a pressure and a struggle. Next slide, please. These are just things that hopefully when you get the slides you'll look at. We are collecting members' FIN's views. We want everyone to talk about their experiences very candidly, that when we then feed back to Ofsted, they are completely anonymous. So we are asking members to join us for our next meeting so that they can speak openly and freely, and we can share with Ofsted. Next slide, please. This is another survey we're doing on the needs. We've collaborated with other organisations to look at the CPD needs across the sector. Next slide, please, very quickly, so that I don't run over on time. Additional services. providers, Ofsted do not like mock inspections, we know that, but what we do carry out is quality review. So if a provider wanted us to come and have a look at their provision, to go through some of that inspection type experience, but really understand and work with our team to understand their provision, see how it would be looked at, look at how the process of deep dives, we do it with the provider, not to the provider. It's not like an inspection, it's a quality review, but it actually gives you frank and honest feedback about your provision. I think the next slide actually might be yours, Sean, but Ian, is there anything you want to add at all based on what I've talked about with Finn?
No, other than to endorse your approach. I said at the beginning, back in March 2021, I think it was probably one of the most significant steps we took was to engage with Finn. I'm not just saying that because Kerry's there, but it really did help us. We've had, I think, two kind of, I know we don't like to call them mock inspections, but we've had two interventions where a colleague of Kerry's has come along and given his judgments on what he's seen, and that's been really helpful, particularly when it comes to shaping our quality improvement plan, because it meant that there weren't really any surprises in the Ofsted inspection. We knew where our areas of weakness were, and we were able to demonstrate we had things in train. The only thing I forgot to mention actually on my slides was a theme that cropped up quite a lot in our inspection was PLT, protected learning time. It's a feature of particularly the policing and nursing apprenticeships, any of you involved in that. But Ofsted were very keen to understand what we were doing to protected learning time, because they recognise that in those sectors there are significant workforce pressures that impinge upon students' protected learning time, and they wanted to understand what we as the provider are doing, because it's our responsibility to make sure those students, from an ESFA compliance point of view and from a student welfare point of view, are getting the protected learning time. So we had to tell a really good story about what we'd done to negotiate and ultimately insist with some of our employers to carry out that protection.
Brilliant. Thank you. Yes, and thank you both for your time. I'm sure everyone has found this hugely insightful and very useful. Before we wrap up, you probably can see on the slide in front of you, we've got a few pieces of content we think will be of real interest today. So if you haven't seen it already, please get your copy of our ebook we've co-authored with Kerry, using Aptem to inform your self-assessment report, SAR. This ebook breaks down the SAR process and looks at how you can use Aptem to evidence the performance of your provision. We'll drop the link into the chat for you as well, so feel free to click on that, and that will come out as well after the session today. Our next thought leadership webinar promises to be a really interesting one. So coming up on the 7th of March, the future of UCAS apprenticeships with Pete Milsom, who's the UCAS partnerships manager. Pete is hugely passionate about this area, and UCAS obviously making huge strides in the area of apprenticeship. So if you haven't already registered, please do register. You'll find the link in the chat to join. And finally, we have an updated version of our ebook, Universities and Ofsted, so learnings from recent inspections, which has been co-authored by us here at Aptem and our HE consultant, Steve Dewhurst, who I'm sure many of you on this call will know. So again, we'll drop that note into the chat and that link so you can have a look at that ebook as well. We're coming up to the end of the session though today, so thank you all for your time. Ian and Kerry, it's been a pleasure. Thank you for joining today. And please everyone be on the lookout for the recording in the next few days coming into your inbox, and have a lovely rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Nice to see you all.
Bye-bye.